This is the battle for Kherson, Ukraine's first full-blown offensive that saw it take back control of the biggest city that Russia had captured since its 2022 invasion. How did they do it? We'll get into the battle and the tactics behind it in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at the Ukrainian plan. This is Ukraine. Kiev is here, the Dnipro River is here, and here's the areas occupied by Russian troops as of June 2022. At this stage in the war, Putin's plan to take the whole country has failed, and the Russian army has fled from the capital. A new offensive is now underway in the east, with the aim of retaking the whole of the Donbas region here, and is making some progress. In the south, an offensive out of Crimea that was supposed to capture the whole of southern Ukraine and its valuable ports has also stalled. The city of Kherson, located here, is as far as it got. The only regional capital that Russia has captured, it is also the only territory Putin occupies west of the Dnipro River. It is therefore valuable. As Russia's biggest war prize, it holds propaganda value, and if Moscow ever wants to rekindle its southern conquest, then this will be the staging point. But it is also vulnerable, separated from the rest of Russia's army by the river, and able to get reinforcements over just 3 bridges that Russia controls. Ukraine, therefore, believes they can get the city back by starving the Russians out, destroy or damage all of the key river crossings, then attack en masse. Eventually, Putin's men will either be surrounded and destroyed, or else run out of men and ammunition and be forced to surrender or retreat. For the ground attack part of this plan to work, the Ukrainians must also suppress Russian aircraft and air defenses in this region. Sending in mass infantry and tank attacks without protection from airstrikes is a recipe for disaster. Crucially, this plan also avoids subjecting Kherson and the tens of thousands of people still living there to mass artillery bombardment of the kind Russia uses to capture cities. While Putin's generals may not care about the lives of Ukrainian civilians, Kiev's commanders do not have that luxury. They must take Kherson intact or not at all. This is Ukraine's first full-blown counterattack, where they combined Ukrainian grit and Western technology to take back the biggest prize Russia had captured since the start of the 2022 war, where they forced Putin's men into a humiliating retreat back across the river and scuppered his plans to take the whole of the southern coast. This is the battle for Kherson, and this is Battleboard. This is Kherson. The city is here, the Dnipro River is here, and here's the areas Russia occupied in June of 2022. As we said before, Russian troops on this side of the river are isolated from the rest of the army and rely on bridges for resupply and reinforcement. The Antonivsky Road Bridge, the Antonivsky Rail Bridge, and Novakhovka, a dam which has a road bridge running over the top of it. These are therefore Ukraine's prime targets. If they can be severed, then all Russian forces on this side of the river will be cut off, at least in theory. One more key bridge is here, in a city called Darivka. This crosses the Inhilets River, a tributary of the Dnipro which flows here. This bridge is part of the M14 highway, the main road that connects Kherson with Novakhovka. Disabling this bridge will therefore cut off Russian forces even further, trapping them on either side, north or south of the western shore. But there is a problem. All of these bridges are deep behind Russian lines, too far for Ukraine to hit with conventional artillery. In mid-July, however, all of that changes. America supplies Ukraine with HIMARS rocket artillery, which can range much further. Kiev wastes no time deploying these to the Kherson front line, and they quickly score successful hits on these bridges. Throughout late July and early August, the bridges are hit repeatedly, leaving their surfaces pockmarked with holes. Every time Russia repairs them, they're hit again. This forces Russia to set up pontoon bridges right next to them, which keeps the river passable, but only just. The flow of supplies is reduced to a trickle. When they're not hitting the bridges, HIMARS target Russian ammo dumps, destroying what supplies they already have on this side of the river. At the same time, Ukrainian special forces carry out a sabotage mission on Saki airbase, off the southern edge of this map in Crimea. Fighter jets from Saki help protect the skies over this stretch of the front line, so disabling the base will help the later Ukrainian ground assault. As these strikes soften up Russian defenses, Ukraine begins massing its assault forces. In the south, the 28th Mechanized Brigade is leading the charge down the M14 highway into Kherson, supported by a clutch of smaller territorial defense brigades. These units are infantry, who ride into battle inside BMP fighting vehicles. In the center, attacking down the line of the Inhilets River, are the 59th Mechanized Brigade, supported by the 17th Tank Brigade, and the 35th Marine Brigade, leading a bunch of other airborne and marine brigades. These also have BMP fighting vehicles, but are also backed by T-64 tanks. And in the north, Ukraine brings in the 128th Mountain Assault, supported by Naval Special Forces and Territorial Defense Units, and the 60th Mechanized Brigade. Russia sees these forces massing and throughout August moves some of its best trained units away from the eastern front line to reinforce Kherson. This will create the conditions for Ukraine's Kharkiv counterattack, which we covered in this video. Once those reinforcements arrive, Russia positions them like so. In the south, guarding this highway, are units of the 20th Motor Rifle Division, along with the 331st Regiment of Russia's feared VDV paratroopers. In the north are the 250th Motor Rifle Brigade and 810th Naval Infantry, backed by Spetsnaz Special Forces. And in the center, a large grouping of elite paratroopers, the 171st Air Assault Battalion, the 11th and 83rd Air Assault Brigades, and units of the 76th Air Assault Division. All these forces are backed by tanks, including modern T-90 variants, heavy artillery like Grad and Pion, and air forces dropping heavy FAB bombs. Having occupied this area for 5 months, they are also heavily entrenched behind minefields and concrete bunkers. According to the Ukrainians, there are somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 Russians in this force. Meanwhile, Western sources report Ukraine was close to manpower parity throughout the battle, likely meaning somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 on their side. On August the 29th, Ukraine launches its ground attack, under the cover of HIMARS strikes which hit the command post of the Russian military in Kherson, ammunition depots in Bereslav, and the bridge crossing the Inhilets River. The Ukrainians move forward. In the south, they claim to break through the Russian first line of defences here to the north of the M14 highway. In the north, they also claim to have broken through the first line here, on the western end of the front. And in the centre, the 35th Marines lead a charge across the Inhilets River and manage to widen a bridgehead on the opposite bank. Despite these early successes, Ukrainian attacks quickly bog down in the second line of Russian defences. Thick minefields slow down their armoured advances, while attacks by Russian air forces, which are weakened but not defeated, also hold them back. Ukraine's jets are no match for Russia's, so they can't stop the aerial attacks directly. Instead, they go after Russian anti-air systems on the ground using Western-supplied HARM missiles. This means they can operate closer to the front line, hitting Russian defences and helping level the playing field. Despite this, the Ukrainian offensive slows down. Throughout September, the Ukrainians managed to slightly expand the bridgehead in the center. They also make small advances towards Kherson in the south, down the highway, and along the coast. And in the north, they push through Russian lines here, but struggle to consolidate the advance and turn it into a wider breakthrough. Come the end of the month, Ukrainian High Command has seen enough and elects to change commanders. Andriy Kovalchuk, who conceived the original plan, is quietly replaced by Alexander Tarnavsky. He is fresh off the eastern front line, where the Kharkiv counterattack, which he helped lead, has delivered stunning results, recapturing thousands of square miles of territory. Even though that offensive has not yet finished, it's hoped that by bringing Tarnavsky to Kherson, he will be able to replicate some of that success here. Assessing the front line, Tarnavsky abandons plans to cut the Russian force in two with a charge down the Inhilets. Instead, he estimates that the Russian forces are weakest in the north, the furthest point from Kherson itself. So he redeploys the 17th tank to the area, and overnight on October the 1st, he launches a surprise assault down the Dnipro River towards Duchany, here. This meets with immediate success. Caught by surprise, the Russian second defensive line collapses, and by the end of October 2nd, they are well on their way towards the objective. Tarnavsky then launches the second phase of the operation, an attack through the center, but not down the Inhilets. Instead, the 35th Marine Brigade and its supporting units swing northeast, threatening to close the Russians in a pincer movement. Fearing the loss of some of their most elite units, Putin's generals elect to withdraw instead, retreating beyond Duchany and allowing the Ukrainians to walk in and take David Brid. By October the 4th, the Russians have given up roughly half the territory they occupied in the northern section of the front line. In and of itself, this land holds little value to Ukraine, but what it does do is bring ever more artillery units within range of the vulnerable pontoon bridges connecting Kherson with the rest of the Russian army. Ukrainian advances in the south between October the 4th and October the 9th do the same down here. Russia now finds itself in an extremely precarious situation. It desperately doesn't want to lose Kherson, but holding it is becoming increasingly untenable. It has already moved some of its best units to the eastern front to defend here, and lost thousands of square miles of territory over there as a result. It cannot risk bringing any more across, and would struggle to get them to the front line even if it could. And the longer it holds on here, the more it risks not only losing Kherson, but losing all of these troops as well if the river becomes fully impassable. In mid-October, in a last-ditch attempt to alleviate the position, these paratroopers in the north launch a counterattack against Ukrainian positions. The aim is to drive Ukrainian artillery back from the river, but they get nowhere. Russia quietly concedes defeat, and on October the 21st, the withdrawal from Kherson begins, though there is no official announcement. Satellites spot lines of military equipment and troops being moved across the Dnipro from west to east, dodging Ukrainian shells as they go. Meanwhile, Russia also begins to organize evacuations of civilians from Kherson. Ukraine describes these as forced deportations, and over the next 2 weeks, some 70,000 people leave Kherson city for the Russian-occupied East Bank. At the same time, the Russians move anything and everything of value out of the city, looting museums and art collections along with local banks. Even Kherson Zoo is targeted, with animals seen being loaded into vans for transport. On November the 7th, the Russians announce all civilian evacuations have been completed. At this point, many analysts expected that Russia would put up a last-ditch defense of the city, fighting street to street. This would have been a nightmare for Ukraine, forcing it to destroy the city it was trying to liberate, while putting any remaining civilians in harm's way. But over the next 2 days, Russian forces simply melt away instead. On November 9th, Russian flags suddenly disappear from local administration buildings. Then, the commander of the Southern Front, General Sergei Surovikin, goes on Russian TV to formally request permission to withdraw from Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. In a highly choreographed address, Shoigu agrees, and the official withdrawal begins. Over the course of the next 2 days, the Ukrainians begin advancing up and down the front line. The Russians use artillery, air support, and landmines to cover their retreat, ensuring the Ukrainians cannot rush after them and destroy them. But the Ukrainians are also wary of a trap, and so take their time advancing to avoid getting caught out themselves. This doesn't stop them from hitting Russian pontoon bridges with artillery, however, which they do constantly. By November the 11th, all Russian forces have withdrawn to the western bank of the Dnipro. Exactly how many made it out is unclear. The Russians claim 20,000 troops and thousands of vehicles made it out, while the Ukrainians claim tons of heavy equipment was left behind and their strikes inflicted serious losses. We're unable to dispute either of these accounts, but whatever the truth, November the 11th ended with Ukrainian troops in Kherson. Here they were welcomed as heroes, ending a 5-month occupation by Russia without leveling the city or causing mass casualties. Videos quickly spread of civilians breaking out Ukrainian flags they had hidden during their time under Russian rule and welcoming the troops. Impromptu street parties broke out and fireworks were launched into the night sky. In 4 months, Ukraine managed to recapture one of the largest and most strategically important cities the Russians had seized since their full-scale invasion. And they did it without needing to resort to a huge ground assault and mass casualties as we've seen in similar Russian attacks. How? When analysing a country's armed forces, it's very easy to get distracted by troops, tanks, fighter jets, warships, missiles, and so on. That's understandable. No war was ever won by asking the enemy very nicely to surrender. However, for all of that stuff to be effective, that army requires another army behind it, making sure it has everything it needs to fight effectively. This is the world of logistics. It might lack the celebrity appeal of tanks and jets, but it is where combat is truly won or lost. Let's say we have a frontline force of mechanized infantry here. Lots of troops mixed in with a few armored personnel carriers and tanks. In order to survive in the field, They need a constant supply of ammunition, food, water, fuel, medical supplies, and so on, plus reinforcements to replace dead or wounded soldiers. They can only keep so much of that stuff on the front line with them. Most of their supplies will be stored miles away, out of range of the enemy, whilst their reinforcements will be resting away from the front lines. Logistics is the art of making sure those men and supplies reach the front. This is done using what's known as lines of communication. Because we're dealing with a ground war here, these are called ground lines of communication, or G-lock. There's also sea-lock, or sea lines of communication, and air-lock, air lines of communication. But those are subjects for another time. Ground lines of communication are the roads, railways, and bridges that run from the rear areas to the front line, and also from the rear areas to depots, production facilities, or barracks even further away. Continuous, well-protected G-lock mean these supplies flow easily, allowing this force to stay in the field and keep fighting more or less indefinitely. If the G-lock are poorly protected, say there are enemy artillery guns within range, or if some of the lines are broken because bridges or roads are damaged, then these supplies will be interrupted. Interruptions will vary in intensity and their effects. If the supplies are only lightly interrupted, for example, the artillery guns are far away and firing infrequently, or the bridges can be quickly repaired, then the effects will be mild. The frontline force may find it cannot fight at full effectiveness, but it can keep fighting. This situation is common in warfare, particularly in Ukraine, where drones rule the skies. But if the disruptions are heavy, for example, there are lots of guns firing from close range, or if the bridges are completely destroyed, the effects will be much more severe. The frontline force is now starved of resources. It cannot attack, it struggles to defend, and it is at risk of being overrun and destroyed. These disruptions might become so severe that the G-lock are cut completely. In this case, no supplies are getting through, and a countdown timer starts. If lines of communication cannot be restored before it runs out, then these troops will not be able to fight at all. With no way to flee, they will have no choice but to surrender. In Kherson, the Russians had three main G-lock: the Antonivsky bridges into Kherson and the Novokakhovka Dam, and the highway running between these two cities. The Ukrainian plan envisaged severing all of these lines completely, cutting off the Russian force and running down the countdown timer until it surrendered. In the event, they were not able to pull it off. They did manage to destroy all three bridges, but the Russians were able to create alternative routes with pontoons. At first, this meant only light disruption, but as the Ukrainians gained ground and brought their artillery closer and closer to the pontoons, this disruption became very heavy. The Russians lost combat effectiveness. They could not attack, were struggling to defend, and were at risk of being overrun. Rather than risk them being destroyed, Russia took the only decision it could. It retreated back across the river to where the lines were more secure. And that's how Ukraine forced the Russians to retreat from the only capital city they had captured since the start of their full-scale invasion. If you liked this episode, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel, and stay a bit longer to watch a preview of this episode on the battle for Taiwan. This is the battle for Taiwan, where, with the help of a team of think tank experts, we look into the future to see what might happen if the Chinese attack their island neighbour. This is the battle where the world's two biggest superpowers clash, sparking an intense and bloody conflict that many fear would trigger a third world war if it ever happened in real life. We're going to get to the battle in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at why China would want to attack Taiwan in the first place. This is the Indo-Pacific. China is here, Japan is here, and just 100 nautical miles off the Chinese coast is Taiwan. It is located in the middle of a string of islands known collectively as the First Island Chain. The chain runs from Vietnam and Malaysia in the south all the way up past the Philippines to Japan in the north. The First Island Chain separates China from the wider Pacific and gives great geopolitical power to whomever controls it. That's because incredibly valuable trading routes run through these waters. By some estimates, they carry $7 trillion worth of goods every year. That includes 40% of the world's oil and almost 80% of China's own energy imports, which are vital to the country's growth. Whomever controls these islands has their finger on this global pressure point and can squeeze it whenever they like, giving them power over all the nations that rely on it. At the moment, the US and its allies have most control. Here's all the countries that have ties with the US in the region, and here's their major military bases. China's goal, therefore, is to break or take control of this chain. In recent years, it has built military bases here and here, on tiny islands whose ownership is disputed, but which China now claims as its own. That gives Beijing some control, but not much. If it really wants to exert pressure on this part of the world, then taking Taiwan is essential. There is a history of bad blood between the Chinese Communist Party on the mainland and the Taiwanese government that was formed when their rivals for power fled there in 1948. Xi Jinping has long promised the Chinese people that he will, in his own words, reunify the dissident island with the mainland. And in recent years, he has said he is willing to use force to do so. Even more worryingly, he has told his military to be ready to do it by 2027, which brings us to the battle. We're basing these events on an extensive set of war games played by American think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the largest US defense think tank. Researchers designed an incredibly detailed board game, the kind used by the actual US government and military to study such things to simulate the combat. Experienced military commanders, ex-senior government officials, and think tank scholars played 25 games to see what would happen. What you're going to see here is their base case scenario. That is, the scenario they believe would most closely resemble real life. However, before we get started, there are a few important caveats. First, the simulation assumes that China has decided to invade Taiwan. Although some experts think other courses of action, like a blockade, are more likely, invasion is the most dangerous, and it is plausible given China's military buildup and aggressive rhetoric. Second, this simulation assumes that Taiwan, the US, and its allies will fight back. Although that is Taiwan's policy, and the US has signaled it would respond, what would happen in an actual crisis is unknowable. Finally, and most importantly of all, this is just very sophisticated guesswork. Warfare is chaotic and unpredictable, and even the tiniest of factors can make a big difference in outcomes. That's why CSIS also tested less likely scenarios to see what would happen if some of their base assumptions were wrong, some of which we'll also explore. This is the battle where the biggest superpowers the world has ever known clash with incredibly bloody results, leading humanity to the brink of nuclear disaster. This is the Battle of Taiwan, and this is Battleboard.